Hello and welcome to part 2 of this crate texturing tutorial. In part 1 we did some really basic photo manipulation to kind of create what we can see on the canvas here. In part 2 we're going to be looking at actually adding some detail to this, some shadows and some highlights, just to kind of bring that depth of the photo into play. And this is going to really pop on the 3D model itself. Really important that we consider depth when we're using materials, because highlights and shadows, or lighting and shadowing, are two of the most fundamental elements of any texture creation, regardless of your workflow, whether it's PBR and hyper-realistic, or whether it's really stylized and just uses kind of like a specular or a diffuse or something like that. So in order to create this, we have to create two layers, and to do this I'm going to spam my new layers button, and I get two new layers. I get layer 1 and layer 2. I'm going to rename layer 1 shadows. I'm going to rename layer 1 light. And it's a good idea, generally speaking, to split up light and shadows, because if we don't, sometimes we need to have different opacity levels for each of those, depending on the material. If I give you an example, metal tends to reflect light quite well, and you can see that these little studs here are made of metal, and they have little specular highlights here. Whereas on the wood, we don't actually have any of that. We have some brighter sections, but this just looks like staining in the wood. It doesn't actually look like it's reflecting any light at all. So when we're painting lighting on wood, it tends to be very soft, tends to be very light, tends to almost just look like a difference in the grain. But we can use that to really create depth, and that's what we're going to be using highlights and shadows today to kind of create. Now, I'm going to be dealing with shadows first, but before I paint shadows and before we talk about the different types of shadows that we've got in 3D, I want to just darken these central slats. They are the same brightness currently as this foreground selection of wood, and it's just not going to look right if we had a shadow and these are the same brightness. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to darken these ever so slightly by maybe 6. Anything between 5 and 10 will be fine, and I'm going to click OK. Once we've done that, we can select the shadow layer and we can start talking about the different types of shadows. Now, there are two types of shadows that we use in 3D. We have directional shadows and we have ambient shadows. Now, ambient shadows are often screen space. They're almost post-processed. So when you're playing your game and you go into the video editor, if you're on PC, or the video options, you'll have something called SSAO, and that stands for Screen Space Ambient Occlusion. And this is a post-process filter where any depth of a 3D object is going to have shadow applied to it. This is just because the renderer isn't always particularly accurate, so having SSAO helps. We can also bake an ambient occlusion map. Now, we're going to be going into this in a future video, so don't worry too much about this now. But what I will tell you is we're going to be creating a very rudimentary ambient occlusion map today with our light and shadows layer. Okay, but we can bake this from our 3D model, which we'll be doing later on. The other type of shadow is what we call a directional shadow. Now, this tends to not be baked. This tends to, well, depending on the object, tends not to be baked. But this is your very traditional shadow. If we shone a light at an object, it will cast a shadow onto the surface that's behind it. And this is what we're used to seeing on a really sunny day. We'll see trees on the road. We'll see all these kinds of things. And this is a directional shadow. Now, we're not going to be painting directional shadows today. Generally speaking, when we're painting 3D textures, we don't want to have too many directional shadows, because often lighting conditions within an engine can change. If you have a day-night cycle, for instance, suddenly those materials that you use in the day are not going to react as well with the lighting at night. So that's why ambient occlusion tends to be the way forward, and that's why we're going to be creating a rudimentary kind of shadow map, if you will, or an ambient occlusion map, as opposed to painting loads of really detailed projection shadows. So we're going to be using the brush tool to create these shadows. So before we actually start painting, let's have a look at some of the settings. Now, there are 3 toggleable options at the top that all deal with pressure sensitivity. Now, in this tutorial, I'm going to be using a Wacom tablet. If you don't have a Wacom tablet, Huion tablets will be fine. Any tablets you can get of any brand that work will be fine here, and these will change the way that your tablet deals with this particular tool. So let's have a look at the lines without any of these selected. If I just select black here and I start painting, you can kind of see that even without these enabled, I'm getting a pretty decent amount of stuff here. But that might be because I've got pen pressure already enabled here. But for the most part, when you first open Photoshop, that won't be the case. You'll just end up with big thick black lines. Now if I select this and I select this one, I now end up with different lines. You can kind of see that they taper off at the end, and the harder I press, the darker my lines are. I don't have any of that tapering anymore. Now the tapering itself is dealt with by this option here. Now this option deals with line thickness depending on pen pressure, and as we flick you can kind of see that this tapers, and that's this particular object here. This button deals with opacity, and it links that to pen pressure. So if I press really lightly, you'll notice that we can almost barely see those lines, and even the line that I managed to make that was a bit thicker, we can see all the way through. And this is because I'm not pressing really hard. If I mash, obviously we end up with a really thick black line, and that's not what we're looking for. Now the central option, which I've saved till last, deals with rotation. It deals with the rotation of particular brushes. Now Photoshop has something called art brushes. Now I'm going to use this fan brush as an example, and if I look at this, you'll notice that as I move my pen here, and that's what I'm doing, two things change. The little icon underneath my pen moves, as you can kind of see that, and so does the icon in the top left hand corner of the screen, and this is the tilt. Okay, not all tablets have tilt enabled, so just bear that in mind. For the most part, we're not going to be using these art brushes, and I'm just going to select one of these other brushes to kind of continue on. But that's what this button does, and I tend to have all three on, just in case I want to switch to an art brush to try something out. It means I don't have to keep reconfiguring all these settings. Now there are two other options here. We have flow and we have opacity. We're going to leave flow 100% for this tutorial, but we will be manipulating this later on. But opacity is really what we're going to be looking at here. Now I'm sure there'll be some people who are watching this who are really great artists and are just looking branching into 3D, in which case just ignore everything I'm saying about brush settings and just jump forward, because I'm not going to give you anything new here. But if you're new to Photoshop and you're new to drawing digitally, I would really recommend changing your pen opacity to maybe 50%. If you're really heavy-handed and you know you can't draw and you know that finesse is an issue, I would change this to about 20%. Now I always have a really low pen opacity. I'm very heavy-handed with the pen. I eat through nibs like you wouldn't believe, so it's really important that you get familiar with your tablet, work out what works well for you, and kind of go from there. So we're going to start with shadows. I always find it easier to paint shadows first. And before we start painting, we need to make sure we have two things. We need to make sure that we have the shadows layer selected, and we need to make sure that we have black as the foreground. If it's not, we can just press X and that will toggle that forward. If for whatever reason we've got red and purple in here, we can just click the black and white box here and that will turn that back to black and white. I'm going to make sure black's forward, and before we start painting again, I just want to make sure that I increase my brush size. What we're looking for is we want a brush size that's going to cover some of this area. We don't want a brush size that's going to cover everything, so 29 is probably a bit big, but we want something that's going to cover certainly these central slats. This just helps speed up the process a little bit, and also it means you're not spending too much of your time watching me work. You can work yourself. Now if you're a perfectionist, please pick a small brush and make this as perfect as you like. I'm just going to be kind of painting. So I'm going to be pressing very lightly, and let's see if we can make some cool shadows. So I'm going to start painting here. I'm going to do the lateral skewed slats first, and then I'm going to do the top and bottom ones. But I'm not going to kind of try and paint left to right because that's really awkward. Instead what I'm going to rotate my canvas. And if you've got touch enabled on your tablet, you can use gestures here. I'm not going to go through gestures. Have a look online if you want to know the complete selection of gestures. You can also have a look on your Wacom tablet drivers list. That will give you a selection of gestures. For now, I'm just going to press R and I'm going to rotate my canvas. If I press R and hold shift at the same time, I get a bit of a snap, and I'm going to use this just to paint these shadows here. Okay, and I find this is much easier to use. It's much more user friendly. I really hate having to kind of cripple myself in order to kind of reach round to be able to paint. It's much easier to move the canvas. Now once we've got the slats, we can then also start painting a little bit onto the slats in the middle. This is going to kind of help us out a little bit. And we don't want to kind of create anything that looks too symmetrical, but we do want to just add a little bit of shadow in here and that's fine. So once we've got this, I'm just going to move on to my slat. Okay, and the slat's going to be exactly the same thing. So I just want to paint from the top to the bottom. So I'm going to start up here and I'm going to start painting my shadow in here, same way as I did before, pressing very lightly. I'm kind of using flick strokes as opposed to big broad strokes. You notice that I start quite light at the top, and you see the kind of the thing go backwards and forwards quite a lot. And I like painting in that way. It gives me a lot of control over the end product. Just going to touch a little bit. Wonderful. So once we're done, we can zoom out and have a look at what we've created. Now we want to be able to hopefully return this canvas to its former glory, and I'm going to do that by pressing R and just clicking Reset View at the top there, and that's going to return this back to the way it was. We can, if we notice anything's missing, we can kind of add a little bit of additional love to the shadow map as we're painting here. Now it's flat. But providing we're happy, we can start worrying about opacity sliders. Now, I've never known anyone that can paint shadows perfectly first time round. It takes a lot of skill, takes a lot of time, and I always like to adjust the opacity slider anyway. And I'm going to reduce this to maybe about 70%, something like that. Between 75 and 70% is fine. And this gives me a really nice, really subtle kind of view. It gives me a really good idea of the depth that I can kind of see here, and that's really the whole point of this highlights and shadows section of the tutorial. So let's move on to light. I want to make sure that my canvas color is now white as opposed to black, so I've pressed X, switches the background to the foreground color, and I'm just going to reduce the brush size. I want a nice soft brush for both the shadows and the highlights. I don't want to use a hard brush. If I'm using a hard brush, I end up with a really sharp edge. So let's start painting the highlights, and we're going to do exactly the same way, pressing very lightly, but this time I just want to bring the edges forward. And if we want to make this look kind of as natural as possible, so if you make any mistakes, please don't undo them, unless for instance you've done that, in which case we can undo them. But we want to make sure that we're just kind of recreating some decent looking highlights here. And all this is going to really look like is that the wood is worn, but I promise you when we're done it's going to look awesome. Okay, so I'm just going to paint this highlight here. Don't worry if you're going a bit quick. Once we've done the main crate, we're going to head on over to the slat, and we're just going to finish that off, adding some highlights to that, nice and light, like so. Excellent. I'm going to zoom out. I'm just going to return my canvas to normal, and I'm just going to now reduce the opacity slider to, again, maybe 70%, 75%, something like that. And you can kind of see the effect that this has. If I zoom out again a little bit, you can really see the difference in the depth, but certainly with the slat. And this is just going to get more extreme as we progress on with the hand-painted stuff. Now that's all we're going to cover in this video in terms of highlights and shadows. What I want to finish this video off with is just a really quick look at the clone stamp tool. Now we've got some blemishes here. We have some iron nuts we need to get rid of, and we're going to use the clone stamp tool to do that. So I'm going to select the clone stamp tool. It's just beneath the brush tool, and I'm then going to create a new layer. Okay, now I don't want to create a new layer above the light and shadow layers. I want to kind of put it beneath them. So I'm going to select the last layer that is well, the layer that's just beneath shadows, in fact, and I'm just going to click the new layer button. I'm going to call this clone stamp, and this is going to be my clone stamp layer. It's generally speaking a good practice to create new layers when you've got new clone stamps or new operations you're trying to push through. This just helps be able to kind of reduce any error margin. Also, as well, it's the most frustrating thing in the world, making a mistake on a layer that you've kind of you've already kind of worked in, and you end up deleting the layer and you've lost a whole load of work. So get used to kind of creating layers and renaming them. Now when we try and paint with the clone stamp tool, we get an error. It just to paraphrase, it essentially says it can't paint anything because it doesn't have a target. Now that target is given to Photoshop by us, and we have to tell Photoshop what part of this material it's going to clone in order to paint. Now in order to make this much easier, we need to change some options at the top here. Okay, you'll notice that my my pen pressure options are disabled by default, so I can come in here. Certainly if it's the first time we've used Clone Stamp. If it's not, these will be the same as you left them. But what we really want to change is this option here, where it says Samples Current Layer. I want to change this to All Layers. Now the difference is if I just sample the current layer, I'm not actually sampling anything. I'm going to have to flick down to the specific layer. So if I, for instance, for this right slat here, I'd have to come over to here. I have to Clone Stamp in this layer, come back to Clone Stamp to paint. Whereas it's much easier if I change this to All Layers. I can then make my target and I can paint in one layer. Much faster, much easier, and hopefully much more user friendly. Now, how do we make a selection? I'm just going to zoom in here. Just a smidge here. There we go, and we're going to make a target. Now if we hold Alt, you'll notice that my crosshair changes. Okay, and this is how we can make a target selection. Now I'm going to make a target selection close to what I'm trying to overwrite. If I wanted to overwrite this nut here and I took the stamp from up here, you'll notice that when I start to paint this, it becomes really obvious that that doesn't belong there. Okay, it's a big differentiation in the grain of the wood, and for the most part wood doesn't wear like that. So we want to make sure where possible we're making selections that are close to the initial kind of area that we're trying to get rid of. Now you've probably heard of the Clone Stamp tool before. This is a tool used to make people a little bit more attractive for magazines. In my case we would probably need a lot more than a Clone Stamp tool. But that's kind of irrelevant. But this is used to remove spots, it's used to kind of add eyes, those kinds of funky things, remove blemishes, and also, in this case, remove annoying texture nuts that we don't want. So, when we get to details like this, we have to be really careful, because what we don't want to do, we don't want to just kind of paint over the top. We want to kind of keep that detail going on. And this is just a case of painting a little bit, coming back, dropping another load of texture, again Clone Stamping, and then just kind of painting on over. We may even find that we have to kind of select multiple areas and paint over the areas that we've already Clone Stamped in order to kind of just clean the area up a little bit, like so. You can kind of see the effect that has. So let's move on over to the other slat. These ones are a little bit easier. I'm just going to kind of paint over these, and then I'm just going to polish that off. Do the same over here. I can kind of see there's a dark grain going through here, so I just wanted to kind of continue that on. Just got rid of that. Although I do have a little tiny piece here that I need to get rid of, so that's now gone. Let's work on the top. And you notice that the more you do this, the quicker you get, the easier it becomes. So and don't be afraid to really practice this. What we want to try and avoid doing is making long strokes, as I've just done there. So if I make a selection here and I paint, can you see how all we end up doing is just moving that particular nut? It just moves. And this is because Photoshop doesn't recognize any changes to the original material. So when you make a stamp, it remembers it as it was, as opposed to how it is now. So that's why we make a small stamp, and then we paint a little bit, we grab another bit, and then we paint a little bit more, and it's kind of it's just a kind of a process that has to take time. You can do it quickly, but for the most part we want to make sure that we are getting a good result first rather than a speedy result. So I'm just going to finish off this last one, and that is pretty much that. So that's how the Clone Stamp tool works. Hopefully you found that useful. In the next video we're going to be looking at how we can duplicate this particular material onto the other squares, but also as well how we can add some really funky hand painted details. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. If you have any requests, please let me know in the comment section down below. It's been really fun, and I look forward to showing you some cool stuff next time. Thank you very much.